At 81 years old, Danny DeVito said something in an interview that stopped the reporter mid-sentence. He was not talking about a film. He was not talking about an award or comeback or a new project. He was talking about a woman. And what he said was this: she was the only love of his life. Not one of the great loves. Not the most important relationship among several important ones. The only one. And to understand how a man reaches 81 years old and says something like that with total and unshakable certainty, you have to go all the way back to the very beginning. Back to a boy who was not supposed to make it. Who was not supposed to be wanted. Who was not supposed to be chosen by anyone at all. Because the story of Danny DeVito and Rhea Perlman does not begin with fame or with Hollywood or with any of the things the world eventually celebrated. It begins with damage. And with the kind of love that only people who have survived real damage seem to find. Danny DeVito came into the world on November 17, 1944, in Neptune, New Jersey. And from the very first chapter, life was already stacking the odds against him. His mother Julia was 40 years old when he was born. She had already raised children. She was tired in the way that certain kinds of women get tired. The bone-deep kind that does not go away with sleep or time or even love. She would say years later, without softening it even slightly, that she had not wanted another baby. 4 words. Simple and devastating, and the kind of thing a child carries in his chest for his entire life, whether he ever speaks about it or not. But she also said, in the same conversation, that she was proud of him. And so Danny grew up holding both of those things at the same time. The unwanted truth and the proud truth sitting side by side. Not pretending one canceled the other out. Just carrying them together the way people carry the complicated reality of the parents who shaped them. His father ran a candy shop in Asbury Park and was perfectly likable in the daylight hours. Friendly behind the counter. Easy with customers. But when the drinking started at night, the man who ran that candy shop became someone else entirely. Danny learned very young how to read the warning signs. Children who grow up in certain kinds of homes develop that skill without anyone sitting them down to teach it. They learn which footsteps mean safety, and which ones mean get out of the room. They learn which silences are peaceful, and which ones are just the quiet before something breaks. Between 1950 and 1955, police were called to the DeVito home at least 17 times. Danny was the boy reading those warning signs from the corner of the room, finding closets to hide in, slipping out to the neighbors when the night took a turn. He learned early that the world inside a home and the world outside of it could be entirely different places. And he was carrying something else on top of all of that. Something invisible to everyone around him, but never invisible to him. A rare genetic condition called Fairbank disease had stopped his body from growing past 4 feet and 10 inches. But the height was almost the smaller part of the burden. The disease attacked his joints relentlessly. His hips, his knees, his spine, his back. By the time he was a young man trying to build something out of nothing, the physical pain he lived with every single day sat somewhere between a 6 and an 8 on a scale of 10. Not occasionally. Every day. He did not talk about it publicly, not for decades. Hollywood would eventually make it very clear that weakness was not a quality they were looking to market. So he kept quiet about the pain. He smiled through it. He performed through it. And he kept going when most people would have sat down and stayed there. When he arrived in New York as a young actor with nothing but ambition and very little else, everything about him looked like the wrong answer to every question the industry was asking. He ended up sharing a cheap apartment with a quiet young man named Michael Douglas, who had not yet mentioned to anyone that his father was Kirk Douglas. They ate canned beans. They split their last $27 to get headshots printed and then walked those headshots across the city by hand because postage was not in the budget. Douglas started booking work. Danny kept getting doors closed in his face, politely, and then not so politely. He parked cars for a stretch. He stood frozen in a clothing store window dressed as a mannequin because the job paid something and something was better than nothing. For a period of time he was living out of an old Volkswagen Beetle and showering at the YMCA because he could not afford anything better, and he was not willing to go home and admit that New York was winning. Hollywood was not subtle about what it wanted him to do. One studio put a formal offer on the table that would be worth close to $1 million in today's money. All Danny had to do was agree to reconstructive surgery on his face to make himself more palatable to mainstream audiences. More castable. More conventional. He read the offer. He took that contract to a beach bonfire and he burned it. And then he said something he would go on repeating for the rest of his life and mean every single time. He said he would rather be a first-rate version of himself than a second-rate version of someone else. He was not performing when he said it. There was no audience watching when he held that paper over the fire. He meant it the same way he meant it at 26 as he meant it at 81. You do not burn $1 million contract unless every part of you means it. By January of 1971, Danny DeVito was 26 years old. He had been rejected more times than he could realistically count. He was carrying a body that hurt in ways most people around him would never understand. He had burned a fortune rather than betray himself. And he was still standing in New York, still auditioning, still showing up. He had survived everything life had thrown at him so far. But he had not yet been truly seen. That was about to change on a cold winter night that neither he nor anyone else in that theater had circled on their calendar. January 17, 1971. A small off-Broadway production called The Shrinking Bride. Not a landmark production. Not a career-defining show. Just a modest play in a modest theater on an ordinary Tuesday night in New York City. A 22-year-old woman from Bensonhurst, Brooklyn sat down in that audience for one reason and one reason only. A friend was in the cast and she had come to show her face and be supportive the way good friends do. Her name was Rhea Perlman. She was the daughter of a Polish immigrant, had studied drama at Hunter College, and was waiting tables at the Rainbow Room between auditions while she waited for something real to find her. She was sharp in the way that only certain people are sharp, the kind where the intelligence and the humor arrive at the same moment and you cannot separate one from the other. She made rooms feel more alive without ever raising her voice or demanding the attention. She sat down in that theater to watch her friend perform. And then she saw him. There was a stocky man on that stage. Not tall. Not the kind of face that casting directors pinned to their dream boards when they closed their eyes and imagined a leading man. And yet something about him made it impossible to watch anyone else. He owned every inch of that stage without appearing to try. The timing of every single line was precise in a way that felt effortless rather than rehearsed. He moved like he had his own gravitational field and everything else in the room was quietly orbiting him. Rhea Perlman forgot entirely why she had come. When the show ended and the lights came up, she did not wait for a formal introduction. She did not hang back and hope someone would bring him over. She asked around until she had the answer she needed. Did he have a girlfriend? He did not. She walked straight toward him. She has been laughing about what she did next for more than 50 years. She came on to him, she would say with a grin. Big time. They went to dinner after the show and they talked for hours. Danny would say later that he knew within 22 minutes of sitting down across from her. Not that he wanted to see her again. Not that she was someone special he hoped would call. He knew she was the woman he wanted to spend his entire life with. 22 minutes. He was certain. 2 weeks after that first dinner, Rhea moved into his Manhattan apartment. No extended courtship. No careful testing of the waters. Two people who recognized something in each other that neither one of them had ever found before, and neither needed more time to understand what that recognition meant. They lived together for 11 years before they ever married. Not because the commitment between them was uncertain. Not because either of them was holding something back. Because neither of them needed a ceremony to confirm what they already knew they had. What they had between them was more real than anything a contract could formalize. A wedding was something the outside world needed. They already had everything. The friendship with Michael Douglas eventually swung open a door that neither of them could have predicted. In 1975, Douglas was producing One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and he wanted Danny for the role of Martini. The director had reservations. The studio wanted a name that already meant something to audiences. Douglas held his ground until there was nowhere left to push. Danny was cast. He appeared on screen for less than 6 minutes. People are still talking about those 6 minutes half a century later. The film won 5 Academy Awards. Danny was not among the nominees. But he was finally visible in a way that mattered, and the industry was beginning to understand that this man was not going away. 3 years later he made the move that everyone in his life told him would end his career before it properly started. He turned down 3 film roles to audition for a television sitcom called Taxi. His own agent sat across from him and begged him not to do it. Television was where film careers went to quietly disappear. Danny had already read the script. He already knew. The character was Louis De Palma, a dispatcher who was petty and manipulative and completely unapologetic about being the worst person in any room he entered. Danny walked into that audition and delivered a 7-minute monologue that left the entire room sitting in silence when he finished. The network still had concerns about whether audiences would accept his physical presence on a weekly basis. The show's creator, James L. Brooks, made the situation very simple. Cast him or find a new creator. They cast him. Danny signed the contract without negotiating the rate, even though it paid 40% less than what the other actors on the show were earning. He did not lose a moment of sleep over it. In the second season of Taxi, Rhea joined the cast in a recurring role. The producers had no idea the two of them had been sharing a life and an apartment for years. They assumed what they were seeing on set was a product of exceptional acting chemistry. It was exceptional acting. It was also two people who had spent years learning the specific rhythms and textures of each other in a way that cannot be taught or manufactured. In January of 1982, after 11 years of living as though they were already married, they made it official. Quietly. Without a production. No spectacle. Just the two of them doing formally what they had already been doing in every way that counted. That same year, Rhea began her legendary run as Carla Tortelli on Cheers and would go on to win 4 Emmy Awards for a role she inhabited so completely that it is still difficult to imagine anyone else in it. Danny talked about her wins the way a man talks when the pride he feels is larger than anything he ever accomplished on his own behalf. Alongside everything else, they quietly built Jersey Films together, a production company that would eventually produce Pulp Fiction, Erin Brockovich, and Out of Sight. They raised 3 children. They maintained a standing rule for years. No more than 2 weeks would pass without them working on something creative side by side. Then in October of 2012, after 30 years of marriage and more than 4 decades as a couple, they announced a separation. The public response felt less like gossip and more like something had been taken from people who had never met either of them. Because in an industry that treated relationships as temporary arrangements and love as a promotional strategy, Danny and Rhea had been the example. They were the proof people pointed to when they wanted to believe that something lasting was still possible in that world. But they did not divorce. By March of 2013, just 5 months after the announcement, people who knew them both well said it in the simplest terms available. They love each other. They always have. They always will. They went to therapy. Danny arranged dinner at the same restaurant where they had spent evenings together in the early years. They came back to each other. A few years later they separated again. And still there was no divorce, no lawyers dividing up a life, no formal ending to something that neither of them seemed to know how to end. When Rhea was asked directly why there had been no divorce, she answered with the plainness of someone who had stopped needing to make hard things sound softer than they are. She said there was a great deal of love between them and a great deal of history. She said they agreed on enough of the things that mattered. Why damage that with the ugliness of formally ending it? Danny bought a house less than a mile from Hayes. They spoke every single day, without exception. They continued meeting at the same table in the same restaurant. Their son observed at some point that the two of them shared a Netflix account and sent each other text messages while watching the same programs from separate living rooms. Two people who had not been able to find the same version of their partnership they once had, but who had also never found a way to truly walk away from each other. When someone asked Danny about Rhea in 2024, he answered without pausing for even a moment. He said they were doing wonderfully. He talked about his daughter's recent birthday and how the whole family had come together to celebrate it. And then he said the part that landed differently from everything else he said. He said that when you have known someone for that many years, you always know how the other person is feeling. That you participate in each other's lives every single day, no matter what the arrangement looks like from the outside. That is not how a man describes someone he used to love. That is how a man describes someone he never found a way to stop. At 81, Danny DeVito is still working and still showing up and still saying the same essential thing he said as a broke young man in a Volkswagen with $27 and a handful of headshots. He refused to be reshaped by anyone else's idea of what he should look like. He burned the contract. He showed up in pain for decades without ever explaining to the public why. He gave $12 million to bone disease research without once attaching his name to the gift. And the woman who walked into a modest theater on a January night more than 50 years ago and forgot everything else the moment she saw him on that stage, she stayed too. Different house now. Different shape to the arrangement. Same conversation every single day. Some things do not end just because the form they take changes over time. Danny DeVito found Rhea Perlman on January 17, 1971. And at 81 years old, with everything he has seen and survived and built and lost and rebuilt, he still says it exactly the same way. She was the only love of his life. Not one of them. The only one. If this story stayed with you, hit subscribe right now. We bring you stories like this every single week, and the next one is already waiting for you.